These product marketing videos have been taking over all of social media recently, and I'm here to show you my workflow on how to make them. Like always, if you want to follow along with me, I have everything I use down below. Before we get started today, the kind folks over at VFX reached out and accepted me into their affiliate program. I've actually used some of their products in the past, so I'm beyond thrilled to be sharing them with you today. In today's video, we're going to be using SynthEyes for the camera tracking, and then Sapphire inside of After Effects for the compositing. Of course, if you are interested in downloading the programs and helping out the channel, I have an affiliate link down below where you can get 15% off your order. Now let's get into the workflow. Okay, so let's get started by camera tracking our footage. Now, today we're going to be using a program called SynthEyes. I'm super excited because this is actually the program I've been using in my own workflow for a while now, so I'm excited to show you guys how it works. But first, let's come up to File and then New and open up our footage. Now I went ahead and converted my video into a image sequence just so it's not tied down by any frame rate. So I'm going to select that and open up the clip. Of course, you want to double check all these settings here and hit OK. And now we actually have our scene in here. What I'm going to go ahead and do is fine tune everything so that everything is kind of that most high quality, and go ahead and hit this auto button up here. So with just that one button alone, it was actually able to detect some features throughout the clip, go ahead and give us a solve, and basically set up our entire 3D camera track scene. And so this is amazing, kind of speed up for your workflow. What we want to go ahead and do is kind of set up some manual settings and give us some more accurate results for our track. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and do a manual pass of all these markers and make sure I get out all the ones that are, in the reflections here, but also ones that are camera tracked to moving people. Okay, so these three over here are kind of attached to people, so I'm just going to select these three and delete them. I also noticed that one over here is attached to this guy's head, so let's delete those. This woman's purse we can delete. And then also, like I said before, camera tracking doesn't like reflections because it actually might give us some wrong kind of location data. So let's go ahead and delete some of those as well. You just kind of want to avoid reflections as much as you can inside the scene. Since we have so many other trackers, it's not going to really matter. Okay, so now that we've deleted some of the moving markers, you'll notice this green and red line down here, and that's basically the frame range that it's using to get a solve error. So what I want to do is go ahead and kind of manually set that. This isn't necessary, but I kind of like doing this for my own workflow. So first of all, let's make sure that the calculations are slow but sure, just giving us more accurate results there. And then down here, if we're in the automatic section, you can actually select this begin and end kind of frame, and again that's going to be where we want the kind of camera to move the most and give us the most kind of parallax data. So if I kind of scrub that out here, you'll notice at the start of the clip our camera moves a lot and gives us a lot of kind of markers in the foreground but also in the background. And so I'm going to set my beginning to be 1 and then my end to be frame 60. I just found on testing this kind of works the best. Of course, if you just want to leave it on the default values, you can totally leave that as well. Now, the final thing that we want to do before we get our first kind of manual solve is go ahead and calculate the lens distortion, because all lenses kind of distort around the edges. And so we want to calculate that. I'll notice this lens doesn't have too much distortion, noticeable distortion, but of course there is still a little bit there. And so we want to get the program as much information as possible to calculate that. And then once we have that, we can hit go up here. And now we have our solve error much lower. So now that we have our first kind of manual solve, let's go ahead and set it from automatic to refine, because now that we have it in a good position, we can go ahead and get the solve error down up here. We want to try to get that number down as low as possible to get a very accurate kind of camera track in our scene. And so what we can do is I'm going to come up here into this track window, and then we have this clean up trackers section. I want to click that, and then we can move that to the side. And so if I select this and this, it'll basically show us all the markers that it's currently selecting. Of course, all of these you can turn on or off. This is just kind of showing you which markers it's actually selecting. And so if you don't have these selected, it'll still actually delete them, but you just won't be able to highlight them red up here. And so what we want to try to do is we want to select kind of the top arrow tracks of our entire scene, and then slowly we're going to whittle those down and delete those until our average solve error up here is much lower. And so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click this 30 number and then drag to the left just until we get some more. I'm going to just leave it at 2 now. You'll see this number has changed to 19. That basically means that we're having 19 kind of markers selected up here. And so once we are happy with that, again, we just kind of want the most high tracked markers there. We can go ahead and fix that, and that'll basically just delete those markers, get those out of there. And now you can see our number hasn't changed, and that's actually because we have to manually tell it to refine itself. And so again, we are on refine, so let's hit go. And now now you can see our solve error is much lower at a 0.57, which is pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a couple more times. So the shortcut is Shift C to open up that window again, and you can see now it's saved our settings and selecting a few more of the tracking markers that are giving us high kind of solve errors right here. So again, you don't want to select too many because the more that you select, the less information the program has to actually determine the 3D scene. And so let's just fix it one more time and then go to refine our solve error. Okay, so I cleaned up the tracks a couple more times and was able to get down to a 0.3 solve error, which is really nice. Now, when we told the program to actually automatically go ahead and track, it went ahead and set up a ground floor plane. You can, of course, kind of select the markers up here and make sure that those are on the ground. But as you can see, it's done a pretty good job of keeping those on the ground plane there. And so you'll notice that all of these blue markers down here are kind of the ones that it picks for the floor plane. So of course you just kind of want to scrub throughout here and double check that all of them roughly follow that. And it does. You can get very advanced into actually setting your manual ground plane. But since it did a pretty good job, I'm not going to really mess around with that. So now what we can do is go ahead and rotate our scene and export out a file to open it inside of another program. And so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come to the 3D tab, and this is kind of just the default kind of work view. What I'm going to do is come up here. Instead of quad, I'm going to go to quad perspective, just so I can see the 3D scene. And if you actually touch this lock button up here, now we can see the camera view, but we also have this kind of grid plane. And so this is where you kind of want to make sure that your camera track is correct. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple of tests to actually, make sure that is correct. And then I also want to align my scene and rotate it so it matches along with the road. And so what I can do is I want to come in here. First of all, I do want to do some tests to make sure that it's actually, on my scene and, camera track correctly. So with this box icon, you can, of course, change the object type. I'm going to hit this button to create an object. And then in the top view up here, what I can do is I'm just going to click and then drag that, and you can see down here it's basically making a box. And so now that we have our box on the scene, again, if you just kind of go back to lock, we can actually script through our footage, and you'll notice that it's actually tracking to our ground plane perfectly. And so, it's giving us a pretty good result. I believe the actual road is a little bit curved, and so if I was really caring about the accuracy there, I'd probably go in and model out the ground for the curvature and all that stuff. But this is giving us a really nice result. And perfectly, fine for what we're going to be using this for. And so now let me tell you how to actually kind of rotate the scene in case we want to try to get this as accurate as possible. So what we can do is we don't want to select the camera and then rotate just the camera and stuff because it'll give us some errors there. What we basically want to do is we have these buttons over here where you can move, rotate, and scale the scene. I want to go ahead and move the scene so that the line right here is perfectly kind of on our sidewalk. And so let's kind of move this scene, and you can select this whole button right here and it'll select basically everything. And so what I want to do, let's zoom in, and with the top view I'm kind of just going to click and drag up until this line is perfectly kind of on that sidewalk area. Now mine is actually pretty rotated correctly for my scene. However, if it wasn't for you, you can press this button. And then in the top view again, you do want to be working in the top view. If you actually rotate on the other views, you'll notice that now our floor plane is kind of crooked. And so you don't want that. You want our floor plane to remain as intact as possible. So most of the stuff you're going to be doing is on this top view. And so now you can rotate the scene and try to match it up to whatever rotation that you're doing. Of course, mine was perfect as before, and so that's why I'm just going to save it as. Of course, I did just want to show you. This is also the point where you can go ahead and set up the correct scale of your scene, but again, I'm going to try to keep it super simple, and so we're not going to worry about that for this tutorial. And so we are actually ready to import this inside of Blender. So let's go up, save our project first of all, and then let's go up to File, and then I'm going to go ahead and export. Now it has this Blender Python script that you can automatically export to. I find that that doesn't really work as well inside of the Blender updates and stuff like that. So what I'm actually going to do is render it out as a Limbic file. And so we just want to locate wherever we want that saved. And so it gives us all these settings, so you can totally mess around with them as you want. I believe all of it is set up correctly for Blender, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And then we are actually ready to exit out of SynthEyes and open up Blender. Okay, so once inside of Blender, I'm going to hit A to delete everything, and then let's go ahead, File, Import Alembic, and then locate that file we just made. Okay, so here is my file. We can just import that in, and you can see it's imported in the camera trackers, but also our camera into our scene. So what I'm going to go and do is just delete all these markers. I'm not going to really use them. Of course, they are there if you do need them. So let's just go ahead and delete all of those there. So we just have the camera in our scene. Let's go ahead and set the background images. So I'm going to go select the camera, go to camera settings, background images on, add image, go to movie clip, and open up our movie clip. Okay, so now that we have our background image in our scene, I'm going to go ahead, Shift A, add a mesh plane, and now we can see how well it actually camera tracked. And so let's play our scene, and you can see our plane is tracking flawlessly. And so this is where you actually want to kind of zoom in, look at the edges and make sure they're not, shifting. It's actually shifting a little bit, and this is where, if I was doing this for a client, this is where I'd go back into SynthEyes and get a super low kind of solve error there, and make sure that the curvature of the actual road is accurate. But of course, since this is simple scene, this is totally fine for what we're going to use it for. So now let's go ahead and set up some render properties inside of Blender. So I'm going to come over to the Cycles render engine. Let's go to GPU compute denoise the viewport on and set that to 64 sample count, and then denoise off for the render. I'm going to set that to a 128. Okay, so now's the part where we go ahead and import in our objects and start setting up our scene. Now you can go download the model I have down below, or just make your own if you want to still work along with us. So let's go up to File, and then I'm going to go to Append. And then, of course, you just want to double click inside of the blend file and then go to Object, and I believe it's just this first cube right here. So once you hit that, we can append that into our scene, and here is our bottle, and we are ready to go ahead and start modeling out our scene and getting some of the geometry of our actual kind of buildings here. So you can, of course, go super into depth and model it out exactly how everything looks, but since we're just going to be using it for shadows and reflections, I'm not going to go too into depth there. So let's Shift A, I'm going to add a mesh plane, like that, and then what I'm going to do is go into edit mode, go to 2 for edge select, then let's Y, move that all the way to the end here, and then what we can do is Y the other side and move it all the way to kind of this end. And again, the kind of makeup bottles are just going to be standing in the middle, so we don't have to be too accurate with our modeling there. So let's X, move that along here, and then GX. I just want to go all the way down until the end of the street to kind of block that off. And now we can go ahead and I want to select all these kind of sides, and then Z, move that up on the Z direction, just so we have some geometry like that. So now what we need to do is go ahead and set up some materials and lighting in our scene to go ahead and match this to the kind of footage, our plate. So let's go up here. I'm going to go to the shader editor, and with our kind of ground plane selected, we can hit new. I'm going to go to footage. This is a part where we need to go ahead and enable a add-on inside Blender. Don't worry, it comes automatically with Blender. Let's go up to edit, preferences, add-ons. And then we want to make sure we're working with the Node Wrangler add-on, make sure that's checked. And with that, we can go ahead and let's add a image texture node, because we actually want the kind of texture of our footage. So let's open that up. Okay, so here in my sequence, A to select all those, open the image, and then let's plug the color into the base color. Then if I hold Z and go up to render view up here, we'll see that our texture is actually projected on here. However, it's not projected correctly, and that's actually to do with the UV of the actual material. So we need to change that. Let's go ahead and select our image over here, and then with the Node Wrangler add-on that we just installed, we can Control T to add a texture coordinate and mapping node, and then we just want to plug it from UV to window. And since we're viewing it from the camera's point of view, it's basically going to project our texture onto the object. If I zoom out here, it's hard to tell, but there is some weird tiling issues. And so what I like to do is come to repeat to set it to mirror, just so it's a little bit of a nicer fall off there. And so now we can get into the actual, lighting of our scene. So let's go ahead and go to world properties. For this scene, I'm just going to keep it super simple. Change this white all the way up to white, because I'll notice in the plate, it's actually kind of just a overcast day. And so now that we have that, we can go ahead and play around with some of the reflections. You'll notice that we have a ton of reflections here, and this is where we want to try to dial that in as much as possible. So let's come over here. I'm going to set the roughness up a little bit, and then the specular down. We do want a little bit of both, since the road is actually going to reflect some of the stuff. But again, we're not going to be seeing the actual, object texture. Okay, so let's play around with our lighting a little bit more. I do want to increase the brightness just a tad, so something like that. That's looking much better. And you'll see that we have all this kind of white here, and that's actually to do because we haven't, closed up the kind of ground object here. So what I'm going to do is go to edit mode and just kind of select all these and hit F to close that in. But of course we can't see the actual object. So what I'm going to do is let's just bring this out and Z, move that all the way out here, just so our camera is actually inside the bounds. And what you will notice is that the shading is kind of looking weird for everything, and that's actually because we're having the object kind of block some of the shadows and stuff. So if we have our kind of ground plane selected, let's select the object properties, go down to visibility, opacity, and then I want to turn diffuse off, and so that basically stops the diffuse layer from being active, and you can see it's played around with some of our lighting of our actual object and stuff. So what I actually want to do is come back out to the world properties and turn the strength a little bit down now that we have that off. And so just match it as much as you can, as close as possible. We're going to be taking it and compositing later, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the physics simulation. And so what I want to do is let's go ahead and hide our plane by hitting H. Then I'm going to go ahead and select this. Let's Shift D to duplicate on the x-axis. I'm just going to place these kind of, just 3 of them and duplicate those in a line right there so they can knock each other over and everything like that. And so what I want to do now is go ahead and set up some of the physics properties. So I'm going to select this over here. We can go down to the physics properties. We're going to set up rigid body. And so now if we play that, we can see it basically falls with gravity. Of course, we do want to set our, kind of ground plane right here. It's going to remain hidden, but it is selected up here. We're going to make that a rigid body as well, but this we're going to set as passive. And now if we kind of play those, you'll see that it kind of bounces like that, being weird. And that's actually because with our plane, it automatically set the collisions to be from our convex hull, and so that's just kind of a calculation that it does based on the kind of volume of everything. Instead of that, we want to set the shape to be mesh, and that'll be much nicer. Also, one thing that we do have to do down in the sensitivity tab, we want to set the margin down to 0 since we are going to be using this as a ground plane. So if we don't have that, then the cubes or the makeup objects will actually be floating a little bit, and so we don't want that. So now finally that we have that set up, we can go play the thing, and now you'll see that it's resting on the ground plane there. And so now what we want to do is we want to do the same exact thing for all of these. So I'm going to set these to be rigid bodies as well. Let's go ahead and set all of them to be to have a mass. So I believe for my testing, I found a 1,250 kilogram is roughly the weight of like a car. And so that's what I'm going to set these as since they're so large. And so let's just set all of those to be that same mass. Okay, so now that is looking good. Of course, how do we actually get it to knock them over? And the answer is to add a new kind of mesh cube. And then we're going to use this object to be invisible, but still kind of affect the settings of our physics simulation. So let's SY, scale that out a little bit. Then rigid body. And then we don't want it to kind of fall down like the rest. You can see that it's exactly what it's doing right now. We want to actually check the animated button over here. And so since we tell it that it's going to be animated, it doesn't fall. And so what we can do now is I'm going to set I keyframe here, a location keyframe here. And then we can go to like frame 80 or whatever and go G. I'm going to move it on the x-axis right there. And I might GZ move that up a little bit. We can play around with some of those settings. I'm basically just trying to get it to hit this kind of top edge right here and make it fall over. So let's hit I and another location keyframe. And so now let's play the scene. Okay, so now you can see it's basically knocking over the makeup bottles and they're hitting the floor and everything. You can, of course, this is where you can play around with your animation keyframes and, maybe some of the mass settings, some of the friction. But this is perfectly fine for my demonstration purposes. And so that's why I'm going to leave it at. Of course, we don't want this kind of cube to be rendered, and so now let's start talking about how to actually render out the different passes so we can actually use that inside of compositing. So I'm going to come out to the render view here, and then we have all this set up. Let's go ahead and go to render properties. I'm going to turn motion blur on, and then I want to go to film and transparent just so we can see our original footage, and we'll actually have alpha in now. Let's go ahead and enable our plane here. And I want to go ahead and separate out everything. So I'm going to right click and add 2 new collections. The first one, I'm just going to name the physics collection. And then the second one, we'll just name shadow. And so, of course, all of our physics objects, we want to be in the physics collection. So I'm just going to place all of those there. And then our plane, we want to be in our shadow. And so now we can kind of turn those off separately from each other. And so now what we want to do is go ahead and do the same thing, but we now want to affect the view layers. And so what we can do is I want to name this one. We'll name this one just the makeup view layer. And in this one, I just want the makeup bottles. I don't want, the shadows to be seen, but I still want the shadows to kind of indirectly affect the reflections on my makeup bottle. And so to do that, we're going to come up here and add a new kind of indirect only toggle. And once we have that, we can now select each different collection to kind of differently affect everything. So I'm going to basically turn this to be indirect only. And so now we still have our reflections. However, we don't have the shadow at the bottom. And so that'll basically separate the two out. Now let's do the same thing, but basically in reverse for our shadow view layer. So I'm going to come up here, new view layer. I'm going to name this shadow. And we can do the opposite, and this physics collection is now going to be indirect only. So we just have the shadow kind of on the floor here. Of course, let's come back out to the makeup tab, and you'll notice that we still see this white cube. And so we want to select that, go to object properties, and all the way down here, we just want to show in viewports and render off. So it's not actually going to be seen by anything, but it still affects the physics simulation. So now that I'm happy with my physics simulation, let's go ahead and bake that out. So I'm going to come over to the scene properties, and we have this rigid body world right here. What I want to do is go into the cache. Let's set the end frame to be the end of my footage, so 115 right there, and then go ahead and bake the simulation. And now you can see that we have better playback here, and the frames are actually baked. So every time that we play this, the exact same physics are going to take place. So now we're ready to render out the multiple passes. So let's come up to the compositing tab, hit use nodes. We have this render layers node here. Let's just shift D, duplicate that down. We can change this one to be our shadow view layer. And then instead of using the composite node and the output properties, we're going to actually add a file output node. And this is going to be useful because we can actually render out multiple kind of view layers at the same time. And so let's come up, select our file output node, go to node and then properties. And we can go ahead and set a default base path. So once you have that set up, I'm going to be saving this as a PNG sequence for both of these. So I'm just going to leave it on PNG. We want the alpha channel, so make sure RGBA, and then compression you can change to whatever. And then I'm going to go ahead and add another input there. So I'm going to name this first one just makeup underscore. I'm putting the underscore so it separates our main line of our text from our actual frame range that it's going to put at the end. So let's just do the same thing for the shadow. So shadow underscore there. And let's, of course, plug the image into the makeup and then the shadow into the shadow. And then one final thing, I want to go ahead and denoise my makeup section. So let's come out to the view layer properties, make sure I'm on the makeup view layer up here. Let's go to denoising data, and then I'm just going to shift A, denoise my final render right there, plug the normal on the normal and albedo into the albedo. And let's go ahead and render image just to make sure everything is looking good. Okay, so now if we shift control click, we can view the different kind of passes that we have. So here is my makeup pass. You can see that's looking pretty nice. However, our shadow pass is looking a little wonky. We should only have the PNG shadow here. So what we actually have to do is back out to layout. We're going to select our plane and we need to go into object properties, and we're going to set that to be a shadow catcher mask. And so now let's render out that image again so we can see what that's doing. And so here are the two passes that we want. We want the shadow pass with the alpha channel and then also our makeup pass. And both of those are being plugged into our file output node. Again, you do want to set your base path that you want those to render out. So now that we have all that set up, we are actually ready to render out our CG passes. So let's come up here to render and render animation. So now we are ready for the compositing section of this tutorial, and this is very exciting as it's a first for the channel since we're going to be using After Effects today. And so let's go ahead and import everything into our scene. So I'm going to right click and then import multiple files. I'm just going to select the first frame and make sure the PNG sequence is checked down here, and I'm going to import all of those separately. Okay, so once I have those three in, I can just hit done over here. Let's get started by dragging our original footage and making a new composition. And then I, of course, want to make our makeup a new layer above that, and then our shadow in between both of those. So now we have this basic setup. What I do want to go ahead and do is I want to use the alpha of my shadow to affect the color of our base layer down here. So what I'm going to do is let's duplicate my original footage. So just control V. And then what we can do is I want to set this to be a track matte, or alpha to be a track matte for this layer right here. So if you don't see that, just hit this toggle switches and modes button down here. And then, of course, for this third layer, I want this to be a track matte for the second kind of shadow layer right there. And it's automatically hidden that, and so that's very nice. You'll see that we don't have any shadows over here at all. And what that's basically done is it's used the alpha of the layer we specified, so the kind of shadow layer right there. And it's basically telling that alpha to only kind of use the alpha for this specific layer. And so this is what we're actually going to color correct to make our shadows match much more naturally. And so let's unhide our fourth layer. I'm going to drag a effect. Let's just go to color correction and down to curves. And then I'm just going to bring this curve down here until it matches roughly with the other shadows in our scene. And this just gives us, again, much more accurate results than it did before. And so now we can get into the fun stuff, and that is actually to do with some Sapphire plugins. And so Sapphire is also part of the VFX suite, and so it's going to allow us to do some custom plugins that are going to give us a lot of options to actually make this much more accurate and a lot more fun to play around with. And so first, let's actually change the color of these makeup bottles. So what I'm going to do is over on this, once you have Sapphire actually downloaded, I'm going to go ahead and type in hue, and down here we have this S hue sat bright. And so we just want to go ahead and drag that to our makeup layer, and we can see that we have all these settings right here. I want to go ahead and shift my hue and just play around with that, and you can see it's doing an amazing job of kind of shifting that, but also keeping our light levels. It's a really kind of awesome plugin for this. So we'll make it red right here. And then of course this is where you can play around with your saturation and also a little bit of the brightness just to match it into your specific scene. So that is looking pretty cool. And just a super fast kind of color change with maintaining our reflection data and all that. So now what I want to go ahead and do is add some bloom back in our shot. And so we can use another Sapphire plugin. I'm going to type in glow. And you'll see down here the S-glow. We're going to put that onto our thing as well. And you can see that's basically exactly what it's saying. It's basically glowing out the higher luminance value areas. And so, of course, that might be a little too much for me. So what I'm going to do is come over here to the brightness and turn down the brightness a little bit, just so it's a little bit of a more subtle effect. And then you can also play around with the threshold if you want it to be more of a kind of, glow type of effect. But again, I'm just using this for bloom. And so I'm just going to play around with that there. So you can see that's adding a little bit of bloom and a little bit more interesting look into our shot. Finally, I do want to go ahead and match the grain to our original footage. And so what I'm going to do is type in grain over here and use the S grain. Just going to put that at the very bottom. Very important. You do want that at the very bottom to be kind of our last thing that we do. And then if I come to, we'll go to the blue channel, since blue is usually where you can see the most amount of grain. I might turn up my gamma just a little bit so I can view it a little bit better. And then let's set my frame range down to like a 5-frame thing here, and just kind of make that repeat itself. And so what I'm basically trying to do is trying to match kind of the grain for my VFX, because that's very important to match it into the real world environment. And so what I can do, let's actually turn the gain down a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. You can see it's very big right now. So I'm going to do the color frequency and kind of just turn that up until we get a result. I'll notice that the grain, I'm kind of looking at this particular area, is very, very small. So maybe even smaller than that. So turn that down. That's looking pretty good. And so now that's way too much. So I'm just going to go ahead and do some of the amplitude down. And we just want a super subtle effect, so it's kind of matching there. You can see that now that matches much more closely with the actual grain of the shot, like over here and stuff. And so let's come back out of here. So I'm going to set that gain down to 0 again, come out to RGB. And now you can see if we kind of zoom in, it's adding some grain in our shot and matching it much more closely to the in real world footage. So once we're happy with that, we can bring that out here. And of course, I'm just scratching the surface with the amount of stuff Sapphire can do inside of After Effects. I believe there are also plugins for DaVinci Resolve and Nuke and a ton of other programs, so definitely make sure to go check it out. Link is down below. Okay, so now I'm pretty happy with how the compositing is looking. However, I'll notice that when the actual things land on the ground, there's kind of a big thud. However, there's not really that much camera motion for it. And so I'm going to go ahead and use one final Sapphire plugin to actually add some camera movement and some shake as soon as the thing slams on the ground. And so to do that, I actually need to pre-compose my composition. And so I'm going to select everything. And basically, this is just creating a subfolder for it to use so we can affect all of these kind of different layers together. So let's go ahead and right click pre-compose. I'm just going to name it pre-comp1, hit OK there. And so now everything, it's basically in its own folder there. And so I can add effects to that accordingly. So let's come over here. I'm going to use the Sapphire Shake plugin right there. Drag that into there, and basically what that does is just add some random shake throughout our scene. I want to tell it to only shake when the actual thing slams on the ground. So let's go to the frame. So this is the frame where it kind of slams on the ground there. And so right here, I want the amplitude to be, at its max. So let's go ahead and hit the animate button right there. And so right there, I want it to have a keyframe. Let's open up the shake effects just so we can see what that is doing. And so let's go like 2 or 3 frames before. And we want to go ahead and tell that we don't want any shake at all. And so to do that, let's just drag it to 0. And of course, since we don't tell it to stop, it's going to just shake throughout the rest of our footage. And so let's go again like 3 frames after that and tell it to go back to 0. So now if we, let this play out a little bit, right as the thing hits the floor, you can see that it basically just jolts and shakes the camera a little bit, like it's creating some vibrations. And so it's a little too much for me right now. So I'm going to change the frequency down, we'll say to like a 3, somewhere around there. And let's see how that looks. That looks a little more subtle and, just blends in the shot a little bit more. Okay, so once we're happy with this and how this is looking, we are actually ready to go ahead and export out the final render. So let's come up to the file, go to export and add to render queue. And then you can of course change all your settings in here. I just find H.264 for me, kind of the default settings are totally fine for what I'm going to use this for. And then let's go ahead and choose a folder location for this to render into. So I'm going to hit the not specified yet. And then of course name your footage where you want it to save, and then hit save down here. And then of course, when you're finally done with that, we can go ahead and render the final animation. Here is the final result. Hopefully you were able to get a similar result or learned a thing or two on the way. Again, huge thanks to Boris FX for this video. You can find a link to their products down below, so definitely make sure to check them out if anything in this video caught your attention. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.